Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight at the first behind the scenes event for Theo. We, of course, had hoped to have you all in the space tonight and share some wine and cheese, but hopefully you have your own wine and cheese at home to enjoy this conversation with. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christopher Pazdernik. I'm the managing and casting director here at Theo Ubique, and I just want to take a moment before we start to thank all of you for your support in making the art on our stages possible. We certainly couldn't do it without you. And we're excited to find new ways as we get back to live events, to find more ways to show you our appreciation and gratitude. So if you ever have something you're interested in hearing more about, please always feel free to let me know and reach out. We'd love to hear what ideas and interests you have as well. But tonight, I'm really excited. We're here for a very special conversation. We have Jamal Howard, who is the director and choreographer of 8-Track. So let me bring him into the room. Jamal, welcome.
Hello. Hi.
How are you tonight? Where are you? It looks like you're somewhere special.
I am at the theater. I am on our set, our lovely, lovely 8-track set.
Beautiful. And Jamal is going to be joined tonight in conversation with Carrie Reed, who is the theater and dance editor at the Chicago Reader, Chicago's favorite weekly paper. And also wanted me to let you know that she was alive to hear all the songs when they first came out. So welcome Carrie into the room. Here we go.
Hello.
Hi, Carrie.
Hi.
How are you tonight?
I'm well. I'm well. Excited to be here. Well, here being my undisclosed, bunker location. But
Well, listen, I'm going to turn it over to both of you in a moment. I just want to encourage our viewers at home. If you see the chat that's going on, depending on how you're watching, either to the right of your screen or below it, feel free to type any questions or comments in there. And later on in the program, Carrie and Jamal will take some questions. So as they come up, just type away and we will be sure to get to them. But for now, I'm going to excuse myself and let Carrie and Jamal discuss a little bit about the 70s and bringing the 70s back in a musical review. Thanks so much, Carrie and Jamal.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
So I guess, Jamal, I'd love to start with asking you, when were you brought into this process? When were you made aware of this show and that, Theo Ubique was going to be wanting to produce it?
Yeah, so I first heard about this project over the summer. I believe maybe in June, somewhere around then, like early summer. I was brought in to interview for this show to direct and choreograph it, and then also to work on the last production that we did, Songs for a New World. So I was brought in to interview for both those shows and got on board, and I'm so excited that I did.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of it. I'd heard of Beehive, which I think was by the same sort of creator. One question that came up, and somebody asked me this, and I didn't have a good answer. In a show like this, how do you handle the issue of the rights for when there's just so many, numbers that I don't know. I'm assuming most of them are not yet public domain, or how does that work? Could you give us a little background on that?
Yeah, so I hadn't heard of this show until being asked to interview for it as well. I had heard of Beehive. Rick Sieber is the conceiver of both of these shows. And in terms of the rights, those are sort of all figured out on the writing end of it and put in the conceiving end. And then they package it up into a deal where when we buy or whoever is producing the show buys the rights to do the show, it includes all the rights for.
I imagine it would be a nightmare if you were trying to get each individual right. Similar question with the As You Like It that the Chicago Shakespeare just did with all those Beatles songs. I was like, they had to have worked out some kind of deal, because otherwise this is just going to be a ridiculously expensive endeavor.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. If we did it all individually, song by song, it would just be a headache and
Right,
cost a lot more money.
right,
So,
right.
yeah.
So and so all the songs came to you are I guess no substitutions, right? I mean, so you're as director, you're working with a set list of when they appear in the show, and then it was up to you to kind of create a concept around it, which, as from my review of the reader, I thought was quite successful.
Yeah.
How did you start envisioning it? What were some of the things that kind of jumped out at you as possible, points of connection, or structuring, within the different
Mhm.
scenes?
So the script itself has a little bit of stage direction and character description in it, and I used that as a jumping off point. Now, in the script, it's very like some simple suggestions of moments or situations between characters. And so I started with the source material, and then as a director, I am
Oh, you're
somebody who
frozen.
will. Oh, sorry, am I back? Hello? Can you see me or hear me? Am I here? I can see you.
I think we're good. Carrie, are
Hello?
you hearing everybody?
I don't think Carrie is, but that's okay.
Live theater or live events?
Yes, exactly. Here we are. Thank you, internet. But
I don't know
I'll
what's
just
happening. Jamal is frozen on my
Hmm.
screen, so I don't know if that's happening for everyone else too.
We're okay, Carrie. Can you see me?
Oh, Carrie just went out. But what I can do is continue to answer that question while
Yeah.
you figure out some stuff. Cool. Um, so so the script as a director, if something's in stage directions and not in dialogue, then I take it as a really great suggestion, but you don't have to do exactly what's in the stage direction. You want it to fit whatever production you're working on. So with this show where all the plot and characters are all in stage direction, so to me that made it a show where I had flexibility to make it whatever we wanted it to be that fit both me as an artist, but then also all of the artists I was working with, the actors, the designers, my assistant director, musical director, all of it. We wanted something that we all felt reflected us as artists and also reflected where we are in a 2022 world, but looking back on the 70s and celebrating them, but not poking fun at them or anything like that. So I started with some basic suggestions with the script and then really just listened to the music over and over and over and listened to the exact cuts of the music that was there. And I listened to the original pop songs a lot and got the feelings of those songs. And then I thought about which characters sing what and how that weaves in and out of theme for these characters, and some themes became really obvious to me. The character that Patrick plays, Patrick O'Keefe, to me felt very much like a queer character, finding out who he is in the 70s and coming to terms with his sexuality and then learning to celebrate who he is and finding a place he can call home, which in this play is the disco. So that was one of the first big alterations to the plot as it's given in the script that I made. There aren't any queer characters or queer relationships in the script as given, and I really wanted to celebrate queer life. I'm a queer person, and I feel like you can't really honor disco and the 70s without getting into queer culture and what those things meant for queer people. So it was something that I really wanted to put into this show. And that felt like it seamlessly fit in with that character. And then we kept going from there. My assistant director and choreographer, Jay Allen, and we had many conversations. I made a whole story treatment that I typed up with all the beats of the story for all of these characters and what would happen to them. And I probably made like 4 or 5 different revisions to that as I kept having conversations with designers and everybody else involved. And then we got to the place where we had this story and we went into rehearsals pretty much with a lot of this plot figured out. And then we just specified it and got into the real details in rehearsal with everybody in the space.
Awesome. I think Carrie's back with us, Jamal, so I'm going to bring her back in.
Awesome.
Yeah, the problem with 8 tracks is sometimes they just get stuck and, you get frozen in there and, so that's what happened. Little flashback moment for me. I think what I really appreciated is that this show and the way that the stories, as you mentioned, introducing queer characters and kind of expanding the palette of that. As somebody who was around in the 70s, I think musically, there's always been this tendency to think of the 70s as it was the soft rock. It was, the 60s was Woodstock and all the righteous stuff. And then the 70s was like everything got kind of dumbed down. And, it was just disco. Oh, disco. Yeah. Ooh, disco sucks, right? I mean, that was the whole dominant thing, at least, as I mentioned in my review. Yeah, if you grew up in a white suburban high school, as I did, that it wasn't, real men don't disco, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And then punk came, and I was really into the punk scene, but even there, that was like, oh, well, we're rejecting, the music of the 70s instead of, and it took me a while to realize that there is revolution in pop music too, and there was revolution in disco, because by the time I was thinking about what disco was, it had already kind of morphed into this idea of like, Studio 54, something very exclusive, something very beautiful people. Mm-hmm. And, maybe it was diverse, but diverse if you fit a certain kind of, socioeconomic profile, right? So naturally, I didn't, as the gawky, whatever, suburban white girl, I'm like, that world is not for me. Whereas, punk felt like it could be. I could look at Patti Smith or, and think, oh, well, okay, you don't have to be a beautiful sylph like, she's very thin, but you know what I mean? Like, but it really ties into this idea that so many of the revolutions that have continued to impact us really happened in the 70s. I mean, the rise of gay rights was the 70s. The women's movement really took flight. I mean, these have all been there all along, but I really feel like they got pushed to the foreground. And it was, looking at these identities that were separate from a left ideology that was primarily led by white males, white straight males. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that was something that your show and the way you've structured it connects so well with. And I found that really refreshing, so that, a pop song is never just a pop song, right? There's always something behind it. And by putting these songs in the mouths of people who have been marginalized, it was kind of letting them reclaim their space, and also making the point, I think, that so often, if you are marginalized, then you're looking for ways to find yourself in a song, even if it's not, like, for me with punk, maybe when I listen to like the 80s, like the Replacements or whoever it might be, it's like, okay, these are the disaffected white suburban boys singing because they don't feel like they fit in, Mm-hmm. So I would have that act of transference. It's like, well, what if I were singing this as, as a woman? What would that sound like, right?
Yeah.
So that was a big part of it for me. And I think that's also what you're doing here. And it's really exciting to see that come together in the way that it did. So.
Oh, well, that makes me very happy to hear that you had that reaction to the show and to what we really put forward. You really hit it when you're saying, these marginalized communities finding revolution in these pop songs. That's how I felt when listening to them. I feel very empowered by a lot of these songs. I grew up listening to these songs through my parents. They were in their 20s. I essentially think of my parents were the same age as these characters were, like going through their 20s through that decade. And my parents were a huge inspiration and a big, point of specificity for me on this show. I actually had some conversations with them where I learned some things that I had like just never heard about the aspect of their lives when I
Right.
was just asking them about the decade and some of the themes that are hit in this play. And as you know, the show is split into 8 tracks, right? And
Hmm.
so there are 8 different sections where the pop songs kind of hit all sort of a similar theme through that section. And one of my favorite sections of the show going into it
Hmm.
before we really started rehearsal was the War and Peace section,
Right.
which has the songs Peace Train and War and Taking It to the Streets and What's Going On. And those songs like immediately inspire me. They were already inspiring me,
Right.
just growing up, and then you as an adult too. And so I really couch these characters as activists, and that they were all people who at some point were a part of one movement or a couple of different
Hmm.
movements, whether it be the feminism
Hmm.
or just the continuing struggle of civil rights, and looking around the streets and seeing like there are way too many people impoverished and we have to
Hmm.
do something about this, to anti-war protests and all of that. And as a group, we also talked about the nuances in those different movements. Some of them had different audiences and different people that were really a part of them, and they did sometimes break down on racial lines or
Hmm.
gender lines. The women's movement, the women's rights movement in the 70s, you know, it was different depending on the color of your skin. You kind of
Right.
had a different reaction to it. I talked to my mother about how she was like, well, you know, the women's rights movement in the 70s was different for me and a lot of the women I knew who were Black. She would just say that, like, well, what we were really fighting for was more, you know, racial equality. A lot
Hmm.
of Black women in the 70s were already the leaders of their communities and were already owners of business and already had these milestones that some other communities may not have, because those communities weren't giving their women those opportunities quite as early. So my mother was like, really, it was just the racial
Right.
inequality that was so bad.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And for the popular women's movement of the 70s, that was more about, in her eyes, it felt more like more white women who are trying to break free of the fragility stereotype that was put on them. But
Sure.
that stereotype was never really put on Black women. So
Right.
they
And
never
even within the
break out
women's
that.
movement, and there's the Betty Friedan thing about the Lavender Menace, this idea, oh, God forbid somebody think that because we're feminists, we're lesbians. And so there was
Yeah.
that sense that, like, distance, oh, no, we're still, like that was the feminist version of respectability politics, I think.
Yeah.
And yeah, I
Absolutely.
think like when movements come out of a certain socioeconomic class, they're going, and I think a lot of the women's movement did come out of white college educated, with at least the people who were kind of in the foreground of it,
Mhm.
kind of were white college educated women who felt that they had been suffocated or not allowed the same opportunities, or they got married and they did, whereas I think if you're working class of any color, it's like, wait, your big problem is you get to sit at home and take care of your kids. And, I would love
Yeah.
that, but I'm out there taking care
Yeah.
of other people's kids, right?
Yep.
Um, so, but, I think also there is, I don't want to say it's necessarily unifying, but I think it's also just something about how the music industry is. In the 70s, I had the little transistor radio, and we would listen to like American Top 40, and
Mhm.
WLS would do their top songs of the year countdown every New Year's Eve. And like, we're 10, so we're not going out,
Yeah.
obviously. So we're sitting there, oh, what's the number one song going to be? And everybody knew these songs. Now, I think in some ways, I think it's great that we have so many different ways for people to access music, whether it's Spotify, Pandora. I've taught some classes on reviewing the arts, and I feel like the young people I talk to now, young being, anything below 35 at this point for me, but they're not as snobbish about music. I think one of the things is when you feel you're marginalized culturally, in the sense that, well, my music doesn't get played on the radio, or my bands don't really get to come around to the clubs very often, or I'm a punk and people make fun of me in my dorm or whatever stuff we were, I was going through in the 80s. Is you get kind of precious about it, maybe. Like, oh, well, it's kind of like the joke about, how many hipsters does it take to change a light bulb? It's a really obscure number. You wouldn't have heard of it.
Ah,
Um, so, and what I feel like now, it's like you can be niche, but you can also be broad, like, and I know a lot of people will be like, I don't like X category of music, but that song's cool, or that, because you can
mhm,
just go and get that song and listen to it. You don't have
mhm.
to, put on pants, go to the record store, buy the entire album, wonder, am I going to like this entire album or whatever
Yeah.
it was, Um, yeah, I always say, like, going to college in the 80s, one thing I found was, and I'm not sure if another record could get to be like this, but the one album that everybody in my dorm had was Michael Jackson's Thriller. Like, everyone loved that record.
Yeah.
The punks were even like, okay, Billie Jean's got that's a really cool kind of weird dark song, and
Yeah.
even the country and western kids, because I went to college in Missouri, were like, well, yeah, that's okay. Thriller, that's a cool video. Video obviously helped change the way a lot of people receive music as well.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think that just a great pop song can be something that breaks through a lot of barriers too, even if it's not trying to be explicitly political. It's giving you permission to feel joy, and there's also something to be said about that when things are not, particularly great. You
Yeah.
know, to be able to say, well, we can put this on, and maybe, maybe it's angry joy. Maybe, I think those things can't, they're not paradoxical really. So, um,
Absolutely. Yeah. With this show, I also like maybe 2/3 of the music I really knew before
mhm,
starting the show. So I was definitely finding some of these songs kind of for the first time or really listening to them for the first time. And so it was interesting to come at a song just knowing that it has some history behind it or has a whole
mhm,
moment in time when it was popular. And I'm not necessarily coming from that place. I'm coming from a place where I'm trying to weave it through this story and this
mhm.
experience and what it needs to be there. So it was interesting. There were some songs that I definitely, by doing this show, I was won over by that weren't necessarily
Yeah,
my favorites going in or my total style of music
right.
going in. And what this show has definitely taught me is how um, those different styles of pop music can really bring in a lot of meaning and a lot of truth and a lot of stuff, even if it doesn't hit your exact stylistic aesthetic. So it's like you can't just count a song out almost because it's
Right.
just doesn't fit your vibe. It's like, nope, that has meaning to a whole host of people. And if we just put it in a different context, then it's going to have an even bigger meaning, maybe even for you as an individual, even if you weren't into it at first.
Yeah.
So,
And I think
yeah.
that fluidity is in the production. I mean, you mentioned Patrick's character, but there's also Jasmine's character, and I'm blanking on the other
And
woman.
Mia,
Yeah, and
yeah,
their sort of relationship kind of ebbs, flows, comes together.
yes.
And I think, I mean, I wasn't dating in the 70s, but older women that I've talked to have said that was, they had more permission to explore sexually who they were,
Hmm.
relationship wise, who they were, and you would see that. Now I think we're, perhaps I'm hoping we're more comfortable with that, but at that time it felt like, oh, well, maybe this is what I want. Maybe this thing that I've been told I should want, I don't want. Or maybe I wanted this for a while and now I want something else,
Yeah.
instead of feeling like there's only one, no pun intended, one track. There are several tracks that you
Yeah.
can choose in your life, and they all have some validity. So,
Yeah, absolutely. That the relationship between Jasmine's character and Mia's character really came right before we started the
oh,
rehearsal
cool.
process. The those characters originally had like love interests with the other men that are in the
Hmm.
script, and again there was no queerness involved.
Hmm.
And then as I was just doing another round of looking through the script, and there were a couple songs I was trying to make really like have I was just like, there's something missing from both of their stories. And I looked at what they sang again and how they sing to each other in the show, and I was just like, oh, this is what we have. We have 2 more queer characters
Right.
in this show.
I mean, are you going to tell me that there weren't a lot of queer women singing? Leslie Gore, hello. I mean, she
Right.
was more of the '60s than the '70s, but I mean, yes, they were just learning to kind of cloak their actual passions in a way that was gendered to what people were comfortable with at the time. But absolutely,
Exactly.
it's not, it wasn't just men who were creating queer culture, and it wasn't just out lesbians performing at the Michigan Women's Festival either.
Right.
So.
One of the things I enjoy about the story that happens in this is there is fluidity amongst people's sexuality in this group. It's not like we're only seeing some clear cut 2 gay men and they're only having a romance together. We see one of those men also is dancing and doing things with another woman, and then the 2 women have stuff together. But at the beginning of the show, Mia's character also had the sort of relationship going on with Wes's character. You can see in the foreground and the background of that photo. And this song also strikes a moment where we found an interesting thing, because it's written as a duet between Mia's character and Wes's character. And our musical director, Jeremy Ramey, who is amazing, and this show would not be what it is without him. He was very adamant about wanting to keep those 2 voices together. He thought they sounded really great together, and I was trying to get him to be like, can it be a duet just between Jasmine and Mia? And he was like, I think the song is more successful between these 2 voices. And I said, okay. And it took me a couple of times, and the group of us a couple of times, to figure out what the situation is that they're exploring this song. And then it was like, oh, they're both singing this song, but to 2 separate people in their own moments of romance. And there we had a wonderful relationship to see where with Jasmine's character and Mia's character, and then another relationship that we see with Wes and Shemaya's character. But this also shows how fluid some of the relationships can be, but at any point in time. But that was especially a thing that was being explored in the '70s, was how we can have different partners or have different try out different things, because Wes's character is essentially kind of like going between 2 women the whole time, and there's a lot of like trio moments between the 3 of them. And so we got in also not just queer relationships and interracial relationships, but we also got in relationships with more than just 2 people, and exploring different ways we can look at stuff like that. So yeah, it was important for me to kind of show these different examples of love and romance, and how that can manifest with all these different people coming together.
Right. And here's a question for you. I think that's for you, Jamal.
Oh, what was my favorite moment in the show to bring to life and expand a storyline into? Oh boy, there were a lot of different moments that I really loved pulling forward. Anything in the party sequence of the show was really fun to do, just because I'm director, but also a choreographer. So putting together a whole bunch of movement and how that movement tells story is so much fun. But doing Mama Told Me Not to Come, which is the beginning of the party scene, and it was just building up these relationships through little moments that you kind of can see happening, where these relationships are starting. Patrick's character and Roy's character start a romance, start like flirting with each other in that scene. And that's where we kind of get the establishment with Wes and Allie's character and Shemaya's character, the 3 of them having moments. Really, all these romantic moments start to boil in throughout the party section, but it's also expressed through dance and through that aspect of it. And that was fun to like kind of also talk to the cast about the different social norms that you'd want to do. Like everyone's just starting to explore these things, so we're not being too overt about what's happening. We're being maybe a little sneaky, and some people maybe think these relationships are a little taboo, so we're being a little under the radar with them. We're not projecting them to the world yet. That comes a little bit later. So that was a lot of fun to put together. And then just one other spot that I have to touch on, because I'm still so surprised that I like this song so much, which is Afternoon Delight.
I was going to say that that's the song that still makes me like flashback to, oh God, not this one.
Yeah. And when I saw it on the list of songs, I was just like, oh my gosh, we're doing Afternoon Delight. It's so obvious and on the nose, and just like, we get it. And it's been a joke in pop culture now for a couple of decades, you know? And so I was trying to figure out how to make it feel more relevant and feel like we're not just going through the song about people hooking up, and having it feel a little bit more sophisticated than that. And I'm going to be honest, I don't even remember who came up with this idea, but it was something we came up in rehearsal, which was to have the song be a recording moment where, so all the characters are in a band together, and that sort of is a framing device for the whole show. And so I didn't want a ton of movement. I just wanted the song to happen with the characters paired up at microphones, at shared microphones, so that they could like have sexual tension and be flirty with each other. And then we worked in the storyline with Patrick's character and Matt's character and Roy's character. They kind of all have this 3 love triangle thing, and they start a fight because that goes into the next song. But that tension starts in Afternoon Delight. And somebody brought up, hey, what if it's a recording session? And it was like Lightbulb.
Well, and I think some of the people in the Starlight Folk Band, they were married to each other, right? It was like it was like the weird saccharine American version of ABBA or something. They were
that's exactly what it was.
Okay, here's something to win for trivia night. I remember the Starlight Vocal Band actually had a summer replacement series. They had their own television series for a while, like their own little variety show, and it only ran like for a summer. They used, back before you had cable, it's like the regular shows would go off for the summer, and it's like, we need to put something up in the summer. So because they had this hit song, they got this show, which seems just like nuts to me right now to even think that happened. But I do kind of remember seeing it, and it was like they were just talking about being couples, and they would have them doing couples things, and together as couples, like, I don't know, gardening or whatever. I don't remember. But, I mean, it was the 70s. It was weird, folks.
The 70s was the time of offbeat variety shows. Like,
right. Yeah,
variety
Shields
shows
and Yarnell had their own show. I mean, Tony Orlando and Dawn had a variety show, So.
Yeah, and that was a big influence on some of the visual cues that are in this show too. Our set designer Mara Zinke,
I can see it now.
We were both inspired by variety show sets and different things like that, and places that you would see these pop artists perform on TV. We tried to go for a feel that felt like that, with definitely some wood paneling that we wanted to celebrate a little bit, that I love personally.
A little rec room feel, absolutely.
Yep. And and then one thing for a lot of these songs and visual cues that I took in staging came from the source materials. I looked a lot at videos of the original pop artists performing these songs live in the 70s. So I didn't look for things that were 80s and beyond. I only looked at these pop artists doing these songs in this decade. And I wanted to see how they performed it, what their flow was, what their energy was. And then I tried to bring that to each of those songs. There are a few times when I went in different directions specifically, but a lot of these songs and the choreography and the staging is meant to be reminiscent of the pop artists who originated the songs or popularized them, and then to put you in that energy space and in that groove. Yeah,
it's, and again, getting back to the whole idea of the disco, it's also, I think that it's kind of interesting, and I'll just leave it at, I'll just say interesting, that when there's a form of music that marginalized people, or a form of any art, start doing really well in and making money in and starting to dominate a sector of the entertainment world, that's sometimes when gatekeepers come in and say, oh, well, that's just not, it's, I think, I can't remember his name now, but there's a great essay by a former New York Times rock critic called the Rap Against Rockism. And, the idea that, well, the real musicians, they write their own songs and they perform their songs and they have a band. And I'm thinking, so by your lights, that means Ella Fitzgerald is not an artist? Does that mean, and a lot of people in the 70s who might not have liked the songs they were writing, but they were also writing, I may not love Afternoon Delight, but they wrote it. I mean, they did that. But I just think that that's another way that the show, in its own subtle way, is giving ownership back to these groups too. Obviously, not every songwriter represented here is from a marginalized community. But by the way you've structured it, you've sort of made these songs a gift so that people can see themselves in it, even if it was not originally created with them in mind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that actually just hits on such a big theme of this show, is people being able to see themselves in these top 40 pop songs of the decade. Different groups of people, marginalized groups, whether that's queer people of color, or different genders not seeing themselves directly represented in these songs, being able to redefine them in a way that is just so much speaking to who they are. Because, again, my parents were around at that time and they were listening to this music, and they saw themselves in a bunch of these songs. Though my dad did very much say, when I told him the list of music, he was just like, okay, so he was like, not a ton of like Black music on there. And I was like, yeah, there are definitely Black artists that are represented within this music, but it's only Black artists that were also popular with white audiences. There aren't a ton of Black artists who are mostly and mainly only popular with Black audiences in this group. And I was like, yeah, there aren't, but there's still a wide representation of stuff that's going on, and I'm gonna make the music that we have feel relevant and direct it towards all these groups of people, so that you can find your own little nugget of truth in these songs. And I think that's what makes it work for both thinking about what it was like in the 70s, but also thinking about what it's like today. Because I think that there's a lot of these stories and moments that are in this show that just feel like impactful to somebody, even if they never spent a moment of their lives in the 70s or only knew half the music coming into it. We have a couple of different generations of families that will come in and see the show, and we see it together, and everyone's coming out of the show taking some sort of truth out of it that is relevant to them. And so I love it.
And again, I think that with the disco thing, it's like, again, to me, growing up, because of my awareness of it felt like the more exclusive Beautiful People's thing. But then to look at it in retrospect and realize, oh no, this is something, this is where club music, this is where people formed their community. This was where they met. This is where they could express their sexuality. This is where, it was underground until it wasn't. And then, I think that in the the HBO documentary about the Bee Gees that aired earlier this year. Somebody, there's somebody who's like, disco was great when it started, but then like everything, people, it ends up with Disco Duck or whatever.
Yeah,
Somebody's
exactly.
like, hey, we can commercialize this and we can
Yep.
capitalize on it. We can make money on it, but that isn't what it started out as,
Yeah.
And it really was a place where, you didn't have to be Bianca Jagger to go to a disco. Maybe you needed to
Exactly.
be Bianca Jagger to go to Studio 54, but there were other options out there for you.
Well, and with disco, like it, started out in the 70s and then it started to wane in popularity. And then it had a resurgence really with like Staying Alive, or Saturday Night. Yeah, Staying Alive coming out. And that and John Travolta and the whole kind of revitalized the popularity of disco again, that brought it back so in such a big way at the end of the decade. Because I think that movie came out in like 1977, I believe, same year as Grease.
Yeah. Like the Bee Gees were like everywhere. I mean, you just heard like they had like I think 4 or 5 songs on that album in the top 10 or something insane like that to think about. But again, I think once it became this idea that this is something people of color enjoy. This is something the queer community enjoys. This is something women I think liked it. Women like it. Not all women, but I mean I think that I think if women want to go dance, they don't particularly care.
Exactly.
What that world is. They just want to go out and have a fun time, right?
Yeah.
Anybody wanted to go out and have a fun time, but once it was like, this is something these groups enjoy, well then it sucks. It's not really. It's not real music. It's not rock, man. It's not. I'm thinking, well, was hair metal? was that? I mean, fine if you enjoy it, but are you going to tell me that it has more,
validity,
socio-political validity than disco? I'm going to be like, no.
Well, and something that's another interesting aspect about disco culturally at the time was that, with the 50s and a huge portion of the 60s, the American culture was to stay away from each other, to not touch each other. It's inappropriate to touch each other in public. We have to have this separation and be super clean and proper, and nothing that's ever sexually suggested, and all of that. And the way we get sexual suggestion in a lot of the 60s, the 50s with like Elvis, and then into the 60s is they had to be more specific about it, and it had to be a little bit more subversive. And then when we get into the 70s, we've gone through some of the sexual revolution of the 60s, and we've now hit the 70s. It was much more okay to be physically close and sexually charged in your relationships to each other in public. And the disco was a big part of ushering that culture back into American life. So that's when you have kind of a return to certain partner dancing and ballroom dancing. That is a big part of disco life. And having that being a return to like, we can move our hips together and we can touch each other and be much closer, and we can be suggestive, more overt about what we're doing. So that was a big part of what we tried to show in the disco section, but it also parallels almost where we are now, or where we're hopefully getting to even closer in 2022 and 2021 when we were in rehearsal for this show. We talked about how touching is sacred in this space, because we're in a pandemic, and we spent like a year and a half not touching each other and staying 6 feet away from each other at least, and not being able to see our friends and family and all of that. And after the vaccines came out and people started to be vaccinated and felt more comfortable being closer to each other, we were sort of like, at least I felt this sort of re-exploring and rediscovering what it means to touch somebody else, and what it means to give somebody else a hug, or to even just hold somebody else's hand, or put your hand on a friend's shoulder, or something
just even
like that.
reconnecting with some sense of communality, being in the theater together.
Yes.
And I was thinking about this when you were talking, Jamal, about like the other great thing about, some of these dance clubs is that you didn't need to be partnered to go. You could just go, and
Yeah.
maybe you just dance with, just with your friends all night, or maybe, one of my partner has she's much, she's in her 20s now, but he said, high school dances now, it's not like people really date in part, it's like a group of people go together to the prom or they go to the homecoming. And I thought,
Yeah.
God, I wish that had been the way it was when I was in school, because I would have gone instead of like, well, nobody asked me, so I guess like
Yeah.
it's like, just go, just show up, have fun, dance your ass off, or
Exactly.
and just with whoever you want.
Mhm,
It doesn't have
mhm.
it could mean something. It doesn't have to mean anything. It can mean something in between, just see where it takes you. And I think you're absolutely right. We are kind of hungry for that, sharing of energy.
Yeah.
In whether it's in a theater, whether it's dancing, so we just kind of have to hope that we'll keep moving in a direction where we can be doing that more. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
Hey, friends. We have just about 10 minutes left, so I had a couple questions I wanted to share with both of you. And then I also just wanted to remind everybody, if you have a question that you haven't gotten around to asking yet, please put it in the chat and we'll try and get to it with the last few minutes we have here. So first, I'll give one for both of you. And of the songs in the show, Jenny and I would like to know, what is the one that gets stuck in your head the most?
Oh boy, you go first, Carrie.
Well, I think I mentioned this in my review because it ties back in because the only 8-track I ever actually owned was Leo Sayer. I don't know. I think I got it for Christmas or something. So You Make Me Feel Like Dancing, when I heard that, I hadn't heard it for a really long time. And then
Mhm.
I saw the show and I heard it, and I keep listening to it. So I guess that would be the one that's stuck in my head. So
Yeah. I listen to this music over and over and over again. I've seen the show so many times that it kind of changes depending on the I don't know what mood hits me, but I'll name just a couple of them that really get stuck in my head. Um Smoke from a Distant Fire, I think, was the
mhm.
first one that got stuck in my head. I actually didn't really know that song going into this process, and I fell in love with it right away. And it's one of my favorites. It was like on my top it was my top song on my Spotify Wrapped list for the year. So Smoke from a Distant Fire absolutely gets stuck in my head. The Letter also gets stuck in my
Mhm.
head. I love this version of it. This is the Joe Cocker's version of the song,
Mhm.
and I only really knew the Box Tops, I think they're
Alex
called.
Chilton. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I only knew their version of it, which came out in the 60s, and I didn't know this cover of it, Joe
Mhm.
Cocker's version of it from the 70s, and I love it.
Mhm.
So that one would get stuck in my head a lot. And then finally, Whenever I Call You Friend, which
Mhm.
because it's whoops, and then I accidentally started
Mhm.
playing music, and that's okay.
Uh,
Um,
fun
and
fact: Whenever I Call You Friend was the theme for the prom that I did not attend. So
oh. Well, hopefully we
So
got you some good
I got to have
feelings
my own little
there.
prom by going to your show. I'm
Yeah,
making myself
exactly.
sound like I was really pathetic in the 70s and 80s.
Not at all. I bet you were perfect. That song's one of the last songs, and this cast sounds so good on all the
Yeah.
music, but
Yeah.
the way they end this show is such on a vocal high note
Yeah.
that song gets stuck in my head. It's another one that I didn't really know going into this
Mhm.
process. I didn't really know it, and now I absolutely
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah.
So,
It is just it's beautifully done in the show.
yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the war number also. I mean,
Oh,
I've
yeah.
never not liked that song, but it had such power in the way
Mhm.
that, with the way you have it staged and with
Yeah,
people
we just
throughout the
come in and
audience,
gut punch you. We're just like, and
Yeah.
now we're at war, and it's we're in the thick
Right.
of
Right,
crisis.
because I think we tend to divide decades in weird ways. Like, the '60s were continuing into the '70s. If you think of the '60s with at least the Vietnam portion of it,
Yeah,
it wasn't like, oh, it's midnight and now it's 1970, no more war. I mean, it's
exactly. It went on because my dad was almost drafted, and
oh my
this I didn't
gosh.
actually even know. He got out of it because he was in college at the time. It was his senior year of college, and he took a gamble and thought that he wouldn't continue his schooling, and he took a gamble that the war would end in time before, because if you're deferred, it's a whole complicated thing. But if you're deferred from school, then the next year, if you don't have that excuse, you're at the top of the list. And so if the war hadn't ended when it ended, then he would have been at the top of the list of that year. And I didn't know that until I asked him about it for the show. So I was just like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that you were that close to it all. And that was like, that was multiple years into the 70s. So the decades bleed over. It's not clean cut.
Although, I mean, Reagan getting elected at the, in 1980 feels a little on the nose for my experiences of the 1980s.
Yeah, that definitely.
Where we had that's a whole other show, a whole other era of protest music to explore.
That'll be next season.
Right.
The 80s for next season.
Happy to do the 80s one too.
All right.
I got a couple other questions here. I just want to kind of rapid fire through these. Probably for Jamal. Just maybe a little bit of insight about what working with Jeremy was like. And what he brought to the process. Theo audiences know he's our resident music director, resident genius, also apt. So Jamal, any thoughts about that collaboration?
Jeremy is a genius, and I love working with him. He is so wonderful. We started off this show, both of us having this discussion on how the music should feel like the pop music that it's referencing. And that was really important to both of us in terms of bringing this show to life. And that Jeremy absolutely spearheaded that effort. And that really came from his brain of wanting the music to feel as much like the pop music that we were referencing as possible, with some very notable deviations and exceptions where it was appropriate. And when we have like a different gender singing a song or something like that, it's obviously going to have a slightly different flavor. But that's probably the biggest impact that Jeremy has on this show, was he really directed these vocalists to sound to create the energy and the sound quality of the original pop artists doing it. Close to You, when they were rehearsing the Carpenter section of music, Close to You, and We've Only Just Begun, that was all about the clean sound of the Carpenters and how do we do that.
And I just want to give a shout out to Karen Carpenter, because again, that's an artist. I think people think of it as saccharine. It's like, no. Those lyrics are dark.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, if you can listen to Superstar and not feel like just a pit of existential anguish in the in your stomach, you are a stronger person than I am. And I think she has been rediscovered, and I hope given more of her place, because I mean, she's always had one of the most beautiful voices in pop music, I think, but it's also the content of those songs. They were not just walk in the park, happy la la songs by any means. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, with Jeremy and the band, the 4-piece band that we have, that is amazing. And he's playing keyboards in it. We have a guitarist, Perry the guitarist, Egan the bassist, and Carlos the drummer. They're all amazing. And Jeremy led that effort. And really, this show would not be what it is if that band didn't sound as good as they do. And then, of course, with Stephanie Miner, our sound designer, who was absolutely integral, absolutely just so important in putting together the sound mixing and quality of it. And
it fills the room, as again your choreography and your staging. It really feels like we're being brought into this story. We're being kind of drawn into this communal circle of people taking us through this, I would argue, a still misunderstood, era in American history.
Yeah.
I have one last question. Jamal, casting sounds like a huge challenge. How did that go?
Oh, what a great question. And Chris, you know about this too, because obviously you were the casting director. Thank you for all the work that you did in making this show what it is and how it came together. So casting was interesting because a lot of musicals have such defined characters and playing on a lot of tropes and, you know, the ingenue or the villain and all of
Mhm.
this. And this show doesn't really have that. And a lot of this show was about creating the characters and the specifics and the nuances with the cast that I had. So, you know, we asked for submissions. We got a whole bunch of videos in. It was interesting doing it during, you know, during this time that we're in with the
Sure.
pandemic. So, you know, called people in for callbacks. We did callbacks in person, which for a lot of people, it was their first in-person audition that they had done since,
Oh.
you know, since 2020, the beginning of this whole thing. And we kept getting the comment that I just like, oh, loved so much, which people were like, this is the first time I'm singing outside of my apartment. We would get people coming. I wasn't prepared for the actual emotional journey it would be just literally to go through the callback process for this show. It was so touching. But we had them sing songs from the show, and I had them do some choreography. They did a version of The Hustle, which was so much fun. And basically had a huge group of people that was hard to choose between because there were so many good people and I could only pick 8. And if I could have, I would have put more people on this stage, but I really just tried to think of who would have the best chemistry together as an ensemble, and then who also would be interesting to work with on developing these characters, because really these actors have developed these characters with me, but not, it wasn't me dictating everything to them.
Mhm.
These characters are very personal to them, and they found a bunch of the nuances and stuff that helps shape this story. So I really just, you know, we looked for people who we thought would be really great to be a part, you know. But the character part and the creation of this story was important to me, so I was looking for people who could fit some general idea that I had about one of the characters, but then could bring in all sorts of nuance to make it their own.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much for
Oh,
joining us once again. We have just about a minute. Final thoughts from each of you, perhaps?
I'm just happy to see the next shows that you cook up together. That's you know, and it's right in my neighborhood, so that's always a nice thing too. So
Always perfect. Just that I had just the best time putting this show together. I love seeing it. It really is just a big joy bomb
Mhm.
that gets dropped on you, and it's just beyond my expectations. I love this
Yeah,
production.
yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you
Well,
both so much.
thanks again to Carrie and Jamal. It was so nice spending an evening with you here. And thanks to everybody else for joining us tonight. Sorry we couldn't do this in person, but hopefully the next one we'll be able to break bread, share a glass of wine, and all that good stuff. So Happy New Year. Thanks again for your support of Theo, and we hope to see you at the theater soon. Thanks.